I didn't even notice when she appeared behind me. 1 second I was staring at the repair manual, lines of tiny print blurring together, and the next, there was this soft click of her heels on the workshop floor. I realized only when a shadow fell over the corner of my desk that she'd been watching me. "You're not paying attention to the lesson, are you?" she said, leaning over, and I swear the air shifted. Her voice wasn't loud, not commanding, but somehow it landed in the center of my chest anyway. I looked up, blinking, trying to convince myself I hadn't been staring at her just now, at the way her blouse caught the light at the collarbone, or how the faint perfume she always wore seemed to linger in the corner even after she moved. Mid-40s, they said, but she carried herself like she'd stolen time from the years and kept every bit. Confident, sharp, almost untouchable. And yet, there was a softness to her eyes, something that made you think she had learned a few too many hard lessons. I muttered something stupid about the schematic in front of me, but she didn't answer right away. She just rested one hand on the desk, tilted her head slightly, and waited. My hand froze mid-turn of a page. I wasn't used to being observed like this. Not really. It was electric somehow. Not the kind of spark you notice in a crowded room, but the quiet, insistent kind that makes your skin feel both too warm and too cold at the same time. "Here," she said, leaning closer, and her fingers brushed against the edge of the page I'd been fumbling with. She didn't move fast, careful, deliberate, but the gesture made me jump anyway. Her touch wasn't meant to startle. It was instructional, patient, but there was a flicker there, a subtle insistence that made my pulse thrum. I tried to focus on the manual again, but the letters twisted themselves into nonsense. My gaze kept straying to her profile, the line of her jaw, the faint crow's feet that softened her eyes instead of aging them, the way she seemed both untouchable and somehow tethered to the room, like she belonged and didn't. She straightened and gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, like she knew I'd been caught. "Okay," she said finally, voice light. "Try it again." And just like that, the moment slipped away. I felt stupid for how long I'd stared, yet I couldn't bring myself to look anywhere else. The workshop felt unusually quiet after she moved back to her corner. I caught myself replaying the tilt of her head, the brief brush of her fingers, the way she had leaned in just close enough that I could smell the faintest trace of her perfume. It wasn't just attraction, or at least not the obvious kind, but a strange, unnameable tension that made the air feel heavier, the seconds longer. I told myself it was nothing, just a teacher correcting a student. But even as I repeated the words in my head, I couldn't shake the memory of the pause, the glance, the breath of closeness, and how my chest had tightened without warning. Later, when I looked up from the schematic, she was gone, leaving only the faintest scent behind. And somehow, I knew I would spend the rest of the afternoon replaying that brief, impossible moment. Her leaning over my desk, her eyes on mine, and the almost invisible invitation that lingered just a second too long. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't even know if she noticed it at all. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I hadn't meant to follow her into the back of the workshop, but something about the way she disappeared behind the shelves made me curious. She was rearranging old parts, her movements precise but weary, and I caught myself noticing small things I didn't think mattered. The slight tremor in her fingers when she lifted a heavy box, the crease at the edge of her brow, the way her laugh, quiet and clipped, could fill the cramped space without anyone else around. "Careful with that," I said, reaching out to steady a part before it slipped. Her eyes flicked up to mine, sharp, guarded, like I'd interrupted some private ritual. She nodded once, not thanking me, not really letting me in, but her hand lingered on the box just a fraction longer than necessary, brushing mine. It was brief, but it sent a jolt up my arm I couldn't ignore. She moved past me, carrying a crate, and I followed, keeping a few steps behind, careful not to crowd her. She hummed softly to herself, and the sound made the air feel different, lighter, intimate in a way that was almost dangerous. I noticed how her shoulders slumped ever so slightly with the weight, how the light caught the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, how tired she looked despite her controlled movements. "You always carry more than you need," I said, trying for casual, but my voice sounded too loud in the quiet. She paused mid-step, tilting her head as if weighing whether to respond. Finally, she said, "I like to do things my way." Her tone was firm, but softer than her words, an honesty hidden behind layers of confidence. For a second, her eyes softened, and I could see a flicker of fatigue there, the kind you only show when no one expects you to notice. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just watched. Her hands, the way they gripped the crate with careful precision, the slight shift in weight when she adjusted it. I realized I'd memorized the little things already. The curve of her smile when she thought no one was looking, the way her hair fell over her shoulder when she bent forward, the quiet hum she made while concentrating. When she finally set the crate down, she leaned back against the workbench and exhaled slowly. I stayed a step behind, pretending to check the parts on a shelf, but really just watching. "You notice everything, don't you?" she said suddenly, not harshly, but with a trace of something vulnerable. Her voice carried a tension I hadn't heard before, as if admitting it was a small surrender she hadn't intended to give. "I notice when you're tired," I said quietly, almost without thinking. She didn't answer, just let her gaze drift past me, and for a moment, the workshop felt suspended between us. She straightened, a half-smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, brushing her hair back with one hand. Then she leaned slightly closer, just enough that our shoulders almost touched as I picked up another part. Her perfume drifted again, faint and familiar, and I felt the heat in my chest rise without warning. It was a small, silent thing, nothing spoken aloud, but it carried a charge that lingered long after she moved back to her tasks. I wanted to reach out, to close the space, but I didn't. I could only stand there, heart hammering, and wonder if she even knew the pull she had on me, or if I was the only one feeling it. And for the rest of the day, that fleeting closeness, the brush of her hand, the weight of her presence, played over and over in my mind, quiet but impossible to shake. The rain had started softly at first, tapping against the windows of the repair shop, and by the time she and I were closing up, it had turned into a steady, drumming rhythm. We stayed behind, organizing parts, because she insisted on finishing before leaving. The air smelled faintly of oil and rain, sharp and comforting at the same time. I was stacking boxes when I felt her presence close behind me. She didn't say anything, just stood there, shoulders brushing mine as she reached for a crate. For a moment, our hands collided, and I froze, too aware of the heat in her skin, the quiet brush of her sleeve against mine. She didn't pull back. She barely flinched. It was ordinary, mundane even, but the tension in that brief contact made my chest tighten like it was being squeezed slowly, intentionally. You should take a break," I said, trying to mask my nerves, though my voice wobbled more than I liked. "I will," she replied softly, eyes not meeting mine. Instead, she stared at the floor for a long second, a shadow crossing her face I couldn't quite read. That hesitation, it was so small, so fleeting, but it made me wonder what she was holding back. I wanted to ask her, to say something that would cut through the space between us, but the words caught in my throat. She was so unreachable sometimes. But then her hair brushed my arm again as she shifted, and I nearly lost my balance just to stand there and pretend I wasn't noticing. A sudden vibration broke the moment, her phone buzzing on the workbench. She glanced at it, lips tightening, and for a heartbeat I saw something flicker, an old pain, maybe guilt, maybe irritation. She hesitated, then swiped it away. I didn't ask who it was. Some boundaries, I reminded myself, were hers to keep. But I couldn't stop watching the tension leave her shoulders slowly. The subtle exhale she didn't even realize she'd been holding. The room felt impossibly small then. The rain made the lights shimmer against the wet asphalt outside, casting a muted glow across the crates and shelves. My hand itched to reach for hers, not in a bold gesture, not in something obvious, but just to touch, to anchor myself in that fleeting closeness. She moved to the counter, brushing some oil dust off her hands, and I stepped closer under the pretense of helping. My fingers hovered near hers, so close I could feel the warmth through the thin fabric of her gloves. Time stretched, The storm outside faded into nothing but the rhythm of her breathing, quiet, steady. "Do you ever feel like you're waiting for something you shouldn't?" I asked, almost whispering, words I didn't even fully understand myself. She froze, hand halfway to a shelf, and for the first time I saw her hesitate completely. Not her usual controlled pause, but something raw, uncertain. She looked at me then, eyes wide, lips parting like she might say something she shouldn't. And I leaned in, just an inch, just to close that infinitesimal gap, to let her see that I wasn't afraid of whatever she might say. Then her phone buzzed again, loud this time, and she jerked slightly, breaking the spell. She pulled back, a practiced calm settling over her, though her chest still rose a fraction too fast. I stayed frozen for a moment, staring at her retreating back, feeling the electric tension of a moment almost realized but undone. My hand dropped to my side, trembling slightly, and I knew I'd replay that fraction of a second for the rest of the night. The proximity, the near confession, the almost touch that somehow felt like more than either of us dared admit. We were sitting in the back corner of the workshop, surrounded by half-finished repairs and stacks of manuals. The storm from earlier had passed, leaving the windows streaked with water, and the late afternoon light was muted, soft, almost melancholy. I hadn't intended to stay this late, but neither had she. Somehow, it felt impossible to leave. She was sorting through a pile of tools, her movements slow, deliberate, and I noticed how her hands shook slightly as she set down a wrench. I wanted to reach out, to steady them, but didn't. Something told me this wasn't about me. It was about her, about whatever weight she carried quietly, always just out of reach. I cleared my throat. "Are you okay?" Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing, a flash of something raw, unguarded, behind her usual composed mask. For a moment, she didn't answer, just stared at me, and the silence was heavy enough that I could hear my own heartbeat in the quiet room. She began, then stopped, fingers curling around a screwdriver. She exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath all day. "I don't know what this is," she said finally, voice low, almost trembling. "What are we doing here?" Her words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were a question to answer, but because they carried the weight of everything we hadn't said, the glances, the lingering touches, the quiet tension that had been building over weeks. I didn't move, didn't speak. I could only watch her, the lines of her face softened in the fading light, the tension in her shoulders betraying her usual confidence. "I feel strange," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Like I'm walking in a place I shouldn't be, but I can't step back." Her eyes flicked to mine, searching, desperate, but careful not to give herself away completely. I swallowed, feeling my own chest tighten. "I don't know either," I said finally. Not romantic words, not comforting words, just honest ones. My voice was quieter than I intended, yet it seemed loud in the stillness. She let out a small laugh, not amused, but bitter, self-conscious. "That's the problem, isn't it? We can't pretend anymore. It's not normal. It's not just work or whatever excuse we give ourselves." Her gaze dropped, tracing the scratches on the workbench, and I realized how tired she looked. Tired of rules, tired of pretending, tired of carrying the weight of something she didn't even name. I wanted to reach out, wanted to touch her shoulder, but the space between us felt sacred, fragile. One wrong move, and it would shatter. The minutes stretched. The room held only our quiet breaths, punctuated by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I wanted to speak, to say something that would make it okay, but nothing felt right. Then, almost too quietly for me to hear, she said, "I'm scared that if I let myself feel, I'll ruin everything I've tried to hold together." Her words lingered in the air like smoke, and I realized I didn't need to answer. I couldn't. It wasn't about reassurance. It was about truth, raw and unvarnished, and it cut deeper than any accidental brush of hands, any near touch, any tension-filled glance. I just nodded slowly, heart pounding, knowing that nothing between us could ever be the same after this, because the silence had finally spoken louder than any touch could. The next evening, she asked me to help her in the storage room again. The lights were dim, the air thick with dust and oil, and for some reason, I felt the tension from yesterday lingering, heavier now. I was stacking parts when I noticed her holding an old, faded envelope. She stared at it like it was a fragile piece of her past. You, you never told me about him, I said quietly, gesturing toward the envelope. My voice sounded too loud in the silence. She looked up, eyes slightly glossy, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she finally lifted the envelope, running a finger along the corner. Maybe I should have, but it was a long time ago, and I promised myself I wouldn't talk about it. Her voice wavered, softer than anything she'd ever let me hear. Curiosity, hesitation, something unnameable made me step closer. You don't have to. She shook her head. No, I want to. Just don't laugh. Don't judge. She took a deep breath, the faintest tremor in her hands. He left suddenly. I didn't get to say goodbye properly. I've carried that guilt for years, always wondering if I could have done something differently. I swallowed hard, surprised by the rawness of it, the vulnerability she let me glimpse. She was always composed, always precise, but now I saw the cracks, the edges of her carefully built armor. My chest tightened. I wanted to say something, to fix it, but the words felt too small, inadequate. Then she turned, a photo slipping out of the envelope onto the workbench. It was her, younger, smiling beside a man whose face was soft in memory. I recognized the same weariness in her eyes, the same longing I'd glimpsed in fleeting moments with me, though for a different reason. That was him, she said softly, voice breaking, and I lost him. And sometimes I wonder if I'll ever forgive myself for how things ended. I crouched down to pick up the photo, careful not to touch her fingers. I can't imagine carrying that for so long, I said, and even my own voice felt tentative. But she didn't respond with words. Instead, she leaned against the shelf, eyes focused on the floor, hands wrapped around the envelope like it was the only anchor she had. For a long moment, the room held only the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant echo of the street outside. I could feel the shift between us. Something unspoken had changed. It wasn't desire yet, not exactly. But the space we occupied now felt raw, closer, and impossibly fragile. Finally, she looked at me, eyes wide, hesitant, almost afraid. I didn't mean to, she began, then stopped. Her chest rose and fell slowly, and I could see the weight of decades in her gaze. The regrets, the longings, the private heartbreak she'd carried silently. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence stretched, a quiet earthquake shaking everything between us without a single dramatic word. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward just a little, the faintest gesture, as if testing the air, testing me, testing herself. And in that small, measured movement, I felt it, the seismic shift. Everything had changed, quietly, irreversibly, and I knew I would never be able to look at her the same way again. The shop was quiet that evening, dim lights spilling through the streaked windows. We'd been working side by side for hours, repairing old machinery, organizing parts, mundane tasks, but the ordinary had become a kind of ceremony between us. No words about what had shifted, no confessions, just the slow acknowledgement that something unspoken had grown too large to ignore. She handed me a wrench, fingers brushing mine. A small, ordinary touch, but it carried weight I could feel through my bones. Neither of us pulled back. Neither of us said anything. The silence spoke louder than any declaration ever could. "You're good at this," she said finally, voice soft, almost casual. Yet there was something in the way she avoided my eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, and it made my chest tighten. "You're good at noticing," I said, letting my gaze linger just a fraction longer than I should. She caught it, the corner of her mouth twitching into a hint of a smile, and I knew she felt the same tension I did, an acknowledgement without words. The rest of the evening passed slowly. We moved around each other, passing tools, checking parts, stealing glances that lasted a heartbeat too long. No grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just the quiet rhythm of two people who had learned each other's silences, who had memorized the way the other breathed, the way the light hit their hair, the small cues that no one else noticed. At one point, she bent down to adjust a loose bolt, and I moved beside her. Our knees brushed. It was accidental, but the world seemed to shrink for a moment. I didn't move away. She didn't. The quiet between us was no longer tension. It was acceptance, fragile and earned. Finally, we stepped back, both wiping our hands on rags, and I noticed her eyes lingering on mine, not with longing, not with hesitation, but with recognition. Everything we'd skirted around, everything we hadn't said aloud, was there, quietly, whole. And yet, it didn't need speech. I reached for a part, and her hand brushed mine again. This time, neither of us flinched. Her fingers were warm, tentative, but intentional, and I felt something settle inside me that I hadn't dared to name. A connection, undeniable now, born from months of tension, small gestures, shared silences, and unspoken truths. She looked at me then, a subtle tilt of her head, a question in her eyes, and I realized neither of us needed to speak it. We'd crossed whatever line existed, not with fire or drama, but with quiet understanding. We left the shop together, walking slowly toward the car, the night air crisp around us. I felt her hand brush against mine again, just once, light as a feather, and it was enough. It sealed the hours, the weeks, the stolen glances, the near confessions. No words, no declarations, just presence. Just us. And for the first time, I felt the impossible weight of everything finally, gently, shift into something real. I glanced at her, and she glanced back. And that was all we needed. The night settled around us, calm, irrevocable, and quietly complete. Looking back, it feels like everything shifted in that quiet workshop, though at the time it seemed like nothing had changed at all. We moved through ordinary days, fixing broken machines, sorting shelves, sharing small silences. And yet, the world between us had tilted just enough that neither of us could ignore it. I learned to notice the way she carried her past with her, not as a weight to be solved, but as part of who she was. The quiet strength beneath her confidence, the way she let herself be vulnerable in fleeting moments, the laugh that sometimes broke through like sunlight in the dust-filled room. And she, I think, learned that someone could notice without judging, that closeness didn't have to be loud or dramatic to matter. We never said, "I love you," in the kind of words that feel like fireworks. It wasn't necessary. Our gestures, the small touches of hands, leaning close to share a tool, the way our glances held for a heartbeat longer than they should, were enough. It was real, earned, and messy, like life itself. I changed too. I stopped trying to force things into neat boxes, learned to sit with tension, to read the spaces between words. I learned to respect her boundaries while still letting myself feel the pull that was impossible to ignore. And slowly, imperceptibly, the tension that had once been unbearable became a quiet, steady presence, one that felt safe and alive at the same time. Sometimes I catch myself remembering the first day when she leaned over my desk, asking if I was paying attention. Back then, I thought it was just a fleeting spark, a passing moment of curiosity. Now I see it as the beginning of something that had been waiting for both of us to notice it, and to be brave enough to let it grow. We didn't need grand gestures, and there was no perfect ending. What we had was slow, human, and layered. It was the kind of connection that leaves marks, not scars, but subtle impressions that shape the way you move through the world. The way I look at her now is quiet but full. The way she looks at me carries trust and a kind of gentle, unspoken acknowledgement. I often think about what love really is. It isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's standing next to someone in a dusty workshop, feeling the brush of their hand against yours, knowing that whatever came before doesn't matter as much as what you're building together, moment by moment, touch by touch, silence by silence. And that's enough. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?